Mae Beckett walked into the matchmaker's office on the coldest morning Abilene, Kansas had seen in the winter of 1878, and she told the woman behind the desk exactly what she wanted, leaving no room for misunderstanding. She wanted quiet mornings. She wanted a man who came home at a reasonable hour, who did not carry a gun into the house, who did not owe debts to dangerous men, and who would sit beside her on a porch in the evening and watch the sun go down without flinching at shadows. She wanted a small garden and a reliable milk cow, and a life that did not rattle her bones with uncertainty. She had already had enough uncertainty to last 3 lifetimes. Her father had been a gambling man who drank more than he earned. Her first betrothed had ridden off with a cattle outfit heading toward Colorado and never written a single letter. She was 26 years old. She was patient and capable and not unkind, and she was done waiting for peace to find her on its own. She was going to ask for it directly. The matchmaker, a stout woman named Mrs. Hargrove who wore her silver hair in a tight coil at the back of her head and kept meticulous records in a leather-bound ledger, listened to Mae's list with the measured expression of someone who had heard a great many requests and fulfilled perhaps half of them. "You want a peaceful man, Mrs. Hargrove said, tapping her pen against the open ledger. "I want a man who knows what peace is," Mae said, which she believed to be a slightly different thing. Mrs. Hargrove looked at her for a long moment, then looked down at her ledger, then turned 3 pages back and pressed her finger to a name written there in firm black ink. "I have someone," she said, though something in her voice carried a careful quality, like a woman choosing the right tool for a delicate job. "His name is Timothy Walden. He is 30 years old. He owns 140 acres east of town along the Smoky Hill River, and he has been trying to work that land alone for the past 2 years. He is not a violent man, Miss Beckett. He is not a drinking man. He is not a gambling man, but I will tell you the truth because it is what you deserve. He has not known peace in a good long while." Mae folded her hands in her lap. "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that gets inside a man's chest and stays there," Mrs. Hargrove said simply. "He lost his brother 2 years ago, and before that he rode with the army out of Fort Hays during some of the worst years on the plains. He came home from all of that, and he has been trying to build something. But building alone when your hands remember harder things is not easy work." Mae was quiet for a moment, looking at the frost that had gathered at the lower corners of the window, the way the light came through it in pale, fractured shapes. "Is he a good man?" she asked. "He is one of the best men I have put in this ledger," Mrs. Hargrove said, and she said it plainly without decoration, which made me believe it. Mae nodded once. "Then let us arrange a meeting." The meeting was set for a Saturday in early February, at the home of Mrs. Hargrove herself, who believed that introductions conducted in the presence of a parlor fire and a pot of proper tea produced better results than those conducted in drafty hotel lobbies or feed store doorways. Mae arrived in her good wool dress, the brown one with the cream buttons, her dark hair pinned neatly, her nerves steady enough that she was only slightly twisting her gloves in her lap as she waited. Timothy Walden arrived 7 minutes late, which Mrs. Hargrove noted with a slight press of her lips, but which Mae later decided she could not hold against him given that the roads east of town were half mud and half ice that particular morning. He was taller than she had imagined, and leaner, with broad shoulders that suggested he had once carried more weight on them than he currently did. His hair was dark brown with a slight wave to it and needed cutting by about 2 weeks. His eyes were a particular shade of gray that reminded me of the sky just before a serious storm, but the expression in them was not a stormy one. It was tired. It was careful. It was the expression of a man who had taught himself to observe a room before he relaxed into it, and who had not yet relaxed. He took his hat off when he came through the door, and he held it in both hands in front of him, and he said, "Miss Beckett, I apologize for being late. The road by the creek crossing gave me some difficulty." "It gave me some difficulty too," Mae said, "but I left earlier to account for it." Something shifted in his face. Not offense, she thought, but something more like recognition, as if she had said something that matched a frequency he was already tuned to. "That is a fair point," he said, and sat down across from her. Mrs. Hargrove poured the tea and made herself useful in the kitchen for extended periods of time, which was her particular skill in these situations. They talked for 2 hours. Mee had come prepared to be methodical about it, to ask sensible questions about the land and the animals and the finances. And she did ask those questions, and Timothy answered them honestly, which she appreciated. He had 80 head of cattle, a small horse herd of 12, a bunkhouse that currently stood empty, a main house that was livable but had not been a home in some time. He had a well with reliable water and a root cellar that was deep enough to keep through any Kansas winter. But then the methodical part ended, because Timothy asked her a question she had not expected. "Mrs. Hargrove told me you wanted a peaceful life," he said, turning his hat slowly in his hands, a gesture she would come to know well. "I want you to know before this goes any further that I am aware that I am not currently a peaceful man. I am working toward it. But I think you deserve to know the distance between where I am and where you want to be." Mee set her teacup down carefully. The fire popped once in the grate. "How far is that distance?" she asked. He considered this with genuine seriousness, not performing the thought but actually having it. "Some mornings," he said, "not far at all. Other mornings it feels like riding from here to New Mexico territory." He paused. "I think I am closer than I was a year ago. I think having something worth building for would help considerably." It was the most honest thing any man had ever said to her in a parlor in her life. She picked her teacup back up. "I think," she said, "that honesty like that is a reasonable start." They met again 2 weeks later, this time at his property, because Mee believed a woman ought to see the actual land and the actual house before she made any decisions. She rode out with Mrs. Hargrove's eldest daughter as a chaperone, the two of them bundled into a wagon as the February cold bit at everything it could reach. The land was genuinely beautiful, even in winter. The Smoky Hill River ran along the eastern edge of the property, dark and serious between ice-fringed banks, and the cottonwood trees that lined it were bare but enormous, their pale branches spreading wide against a sky that had gone the soft gray-white of old pewter. The grass was winter-dead, but the shape of the land was good, rolling gently in ways that suggested it would hold water in the spring and drain it in the summer. The house itself was a different thing. It was structurally sound. Timothy had been right about that. It was a proper 2-story frame house, which was more than most homesteads had in this part of Kansas in 1878, and the roof was solid and the windows were intact. But it had the particular quality of a house that a man lived in rather than inhabited. There were no curtains. There was no rug by the door. The kitchen was clean but stripped of everything domestic. The walls held no pictures, no calendar, no mirror. There was a table with 2 mismatched chairs, a cast iron stove, a shelf of practical books, and a coat hook by the door. Mee stood in the middle of the main room and looked at all of it, and Timothy stood near the door watching her look, his hat in his hands again, his expression doing its careful work. "I know it needs things," he said. "It does," she agreed, but not unkindly. She turned to look at him. "But everything it needs can be provided. That is not always the case with a house." She looked at the window that faced west, the one that would catch the last of the afternoon light. She thought about curtains she could make from calico, blue perhaps, or a yellow gold. She thought about the garden that could go along the south side of the house where the winter sun struck longest. She thought about what this room could be, with time and intention and 2 people in it instead of one man's careful solitude. "Can I see the rest?" she asked. He showed her everything. The root cellar, which was as deep and well constructed as he had said. The barn, which was tidy and well kept in a way the house was not, which told her something about where he had been spending his attention. The horse pasture, where 12 horses moved in the cold with easy confidence, their breath coming in white clouds, their colors a pleasing mix of bay and roan and one black with a white blaze. The cattle were further out, visible as dark shapes against the winter-pale grass. She met his horse last, a big gray gelding named Reckoning, and when she held her hand out to the animal and it pressed its nose against her palm with immediate trust, Timothy watched this with an expression she could not fully read but which made her feel, unexpectedly, like something important had just been decided. On the ride back to town, Mrs. Hargrove's daughter asked me what she thought. "I think," Mae said, watching the road ahead, "that I am going to say yes." She said yes the following Saturday, in Mrs. Hargrove's parlor again, with the same fire in the grate. Timothy received this with a careful stillness that took her a moment to understand. Then she understood. He had not been certain she would say it. He had been preparing himself for the other answer. "You are sure?" he asked. "I am 26 years old and I am sure," she said. "I would not have said it otherwise." He nodded once, slowly, and then he smiled, and it was the first real smile she had seen from him, and it changed his entire face, turned it briefly into something younger and less weathered and genuinely warm. And Mae Beckett thought, quietly but with considerable conviction, that she was going to be very glad she had walked into Mrs. Hargrove's office on that cold February morning. They were married in April, which was Mae's insistence, because she had no intention of waiting through an entire Kansas winter when the decision had already been made. The wedding was held at the small Methodist church in Abilene, attended by Mrs. Hargrove, who seemed quietly pleased with herself, and by Mae's older sister Clara, who came down from Salina for the occasion, and by Timothy's nearest neighbor, a weathered rancher named Douglas Pratt, who had watched Timothy's land during the worst of the winter and who shook Timothy's hand after the ceremony with genuine feeling. There was also a man named Elias Webb at the wedding, a former Army colleague of Timothy's, shorter than Timothy by half a foot, and built like a man who had survived things by being harder than the things that tried to break him. Elias had ridden 2 days from Dodge City to be there, and he spent the ceremony standing in the back of the church with his arms crossed and his eyes wet, which he clearly found embarrassing and which Mae found, privately, entirely endearing. The ride out to the homestead after the ceremony was the first time Mae had been truly alone with Timothy, and they rode mostly in a comfortable quiet, the April prairie opening up around them in the beginnings of its green, the sky enormous and blue in the way it only got on the best spring days. Mae had 3 trunks in the wagon behind them, everything she owned in the world, and she watched the land they were crossing with a feeling that was partly nervousness and partly something deeper and harder to name, the feeling of a compass needle swinging toward its correct direction after years of uncertain wandering. "Are you nervous?" Timothy asked, which surprised her because he had not said much since they left town. "A little," she admitted. "So am I," he said, which surprised her further, and which she appreciated more than she could easily express. The house looked different that afternoon, perhaps because of the light or perhaps because of the shift in how she understood herself in relation to it. It was her house now. She stood in the doorway of the main room and felt the particular weight of that truth, how it settled, and how it lifted at the same time. Timothy carried her trunks in without being asked and set them at the foot of the stairs, and then he stood in the middle of the room looking at her with that careful, watchful expression, and Mae took a breath and began. She had brought calico in a warm gold color for the west-facing window, because she had changed her mind from blue. She had brought a braided rug in shades of rust and cream. She had brought her mother's cast iron skillet, 3 good pottery mugs, a small oval mirror, and a tin of herbs she had grown herself and dried over the winter. She began placing things, and Timothy watched her do it, and gradually the room began to change. By the time she put the calico curtains up in the west window and the afternoon light came through them in that warm gold color, filling the room with something it had not had before, Timothy was standing by the stove with his arms crossed and a look on his face that Mae could only describe as undone. Not in a bad way, in the way of a man seeing something he had stopped believing was possible. "It looks like a home," he said quietly. "It is one," she said, and she meant it as a fact rather than a sentiment because that was how she operated. The first weeks of their marriage were a process of discovery that Mae found alternately delightful and challenging, which she had expected, because she was a realistic woman and had not imagined marriage to be simple even when it was chosen carefully. What she discovered about Timothy Walden in those early weeks was this: he was a man of deep consideration and very little waste. He did not speak unless he had something worth saying, but when he spoke, she always wanted to hear it. He was more physically capable than she had initially assessed, able to work from first light to last without apparent fatigue, and the state of his animals and his land reflected a man who took genuine care of the things in his keeping. He was a fair and patient teacher, which she discovered when she asked him to show her the workings of the property, and he did so without the particular condescension that many men of the era applied to such instruction. But she also discovered the harder things. The nightmares came perhaps twice a week, sometimes more. They were not dramatic the way she might have imagined nightmares to be. They were quiet, which was somehow worse. He simply went very still in his sleep, and then his breathing changed and she would wake to the sound of him not making any sound at all, like a man who had learned to survive by being as silent as possible in the dark. Then he would wake suddenly, and he would sit up, and there would be a moment, sometimes 30 seconds, sometimes longer, when he was not entirely in the room with her. The first time this happened, Mae sat up with him and put her hand on his arm, and he looked at her with those stormy gray eyes that were not yet fully present, and she said quietly, "You are in your house. You are all right." He breathed. He came back. He did not apologize, which she had half expected him to do, and she was glad for that. Instead, he said, after a moment, "I used to sleep alone, so I did not have to manage this." "You do not have to manage it alone anymore," she said simply, with no particular drama. He looked at her for a long time in the dark. "No," he said, "I suppose I do not." She did not push him to talk about what he had seen during his years with the army, because she understood that some things could not be reduced to conversation, and that trying to do so was a kind of violence of its own. But she made it possible for him to talk when he wanted to, by creating the kind of evenings where things could be said. They developed a habit, as spring deepened around them, of sitting on the porch after supper. Mae had moved the two mismatched chairs out there and added a third, a rocking chair she had traded a basket of preserves for at the general store in town. They would sit as the light went down, Mae often with her mending or her letter writing, Timothy often with nothing in his hands at all, which she came to understand was itself an achievement for him, that stillness without restlessness. One evening in late April, when the prairie was putting on its first serious green and the cottonwoods along the river were foaming white with their particular spring extravagance, Timothy said, out of what had seemed like a comfortable silence, "My brother's name was Samuel." Mae set her mending down in her lap. "He was 23 when he died," Timothy said. "He came out here because I came out here. He thought I knew what I was doing." He was quiet for a moment. There was a fever. It went through 3 homesteads in the fall of '76. It took him in 4 days. "I am sorry," Mae said. She did not reach for his hand immediately because she understood him well enough by now to know that he needed to finish the shape of the thing before comfort would land properly. "He never built anything," Timothy said. "He was going to. He had a parcel picked out north of mine along the river. He talked about it constantly, what he was going to plant, what color he was going to paint the shutters." He stopped. "Green," he said after a moment. He was going to paint them green. Mae reached across then and put her hand over his where it rested on the arm of his chair. "The land he wanted," she said. "Is it still available?" Timothy looked at her. "I don't know. I have not been able to bring myself to look." "When you are ready," she said, "we could find out." He turned his hand over beneath hers and held it, which was, in the economy of his gestures, an enormous statement. Spring moved into summer, and Mae Beckett Walden, as she now was, had built something she was genuinely proud of. The garden along the south side of the house was producing magnificently, because she had good hands for growing things, And because the Kansas soil in that river bottom land was deep and dark and generous when you treated it well. She had tomatoes and beans and squash, and a row of sunflowers that had no practical purpose whatsoever, but which made her happy every morning when she saw them from the kitchen window, their enormous yellow faces tracking the sun with patient devotion. She had also acquired a milk cow, a placid red-and-white thing she named Persimmon, who gave good milk and seemed entirely untroubled by the universe in a way me found inspiring. The bunkhouse, which had been empty, was not empty anymore. In May, a young man named Jesse Alcott arrived, 17 years old, looking for work, his horse lame and his funds at absolute zero. Me fed him supper before Timothy had a chance to decide anything, which Timothy noticed with an expression that was more amused than annoyed. And the next morning Jesse began working the cattle with Timothy and proved himself competent enough that by June he was drawing a proper wage. Jesse was a cheerful, garrulous presence that was good for the property and particularly good for Timothy, me thought, because a young man who required patient instruction and who asked approximately 10,000 questions a day about cattle and horses and land management, and the correct way to fix a fence post, and what kind of weather a particular cloud formation predicted, was a good thing to have around a man who had been living too much inside his own head. She watched them sometimes, from the garden or from the kitchen window, Timothy and Jesse working together in the late afternoon light, and something in the image made her feel quiet and satisfied in the best possible way. Elias Webb came to visit in June, riding up on a Monday morning on a road-dusty horse with a saddlebag full of dried beef and a fresh bottle of whiskey, which me accepted with a raised eyebrow and placed on the highest kitchen shelf. Elias Webb was 42 years old and had the particular manner of a man who had survived the frontier by being exactly himself at all times, which had cost him some things and earned him others. He and Timothy had served together out of Fort Hays during the campaigns of the early 70s, and the bond between them was the specific kind built by men who have relied on each other for things that could not be explained in polite company. They greeted each other the way such men did, briefly and firmly, and within 20 minutes were sitting on me's porch drinking coffee from two of her good pottery mugs and talking in the half-finished way of people who already share the relevant context. Me brought them more coffee and then sat down in the rocking chair with her mending, because she had decided early in her marriage that being present without intruding was a skill worth cultivating, and she was getting quite good at it. She listened to them talk, not everything making sense to her, some of it in the kind of reference that only meant something to people who had been there, and she mended a torn sleeve on Timothy's good shirt and watched her husband. He was different with Elias than with other people. Not better or worse, just different. There was a relaxation in him that she recognized as rare, the relaxation of a man who did not have to explain himself. At one point, Elias looked over at me and then back at Timothy and said, "She is not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Timothy asked. "I don't know, someone more nervous, I suppose." "She is not very nervous," Timothy said, and there was something in how he said it that was not quite a compliment but was considerably more than an observation. Me kept her eyes on her mending and did not smile, quite. Elias stayed 3 days, and me cooked for him, and listened to him tell stories, and made a private assessment of him as a man who was fundamentally good, but had been sharpened by the frontier into something that cut a little too quickly sometimes, and who was lonely in the particular way of men who have decided companionship costs more than it is worth. On his last morning, as she packed him a cloth with biscuits and dried apple for the road, he leaned against the kitchen doorframe and said, "He is better than he was." "He is better than he was last month," me said. Elias was quiet for a moment. "I was not sure he was going to be all right," he said. "After Samuel, after all of it." Me wrapped the cloth carefully. "He is going to be more than all right," she said. She did not say it with bravado. She said it with the same tone she used when she said the corn would be ready by August, or that the east pasture fence needed mending before winter. She said it like a fact she had already confirmed. Elias looked at her with an expression that was simultaneously skeptical and desperately willing to believe her, and he took the cloth of biscuits and said nothing more, and rode out that morning on his road-dusty horse. The real test came in July. It arrived in the form of 3 men on the Walden property on a Tuesday afternoon, when Mae was in the garden and Jesse was in town picking up supplies. Timothy was at the river checking a fence line, which meant Mae was alone at the house when the men rode up. They were rough-looking men, trail-dusty and hard-eyed, and the one in front had a quality about him that Mae recognized from her father's gambling days, the quality of a man accustomed to taking things. He said his name was Carver, and he said he had ridden with Timothy Walden's brother Samuel, and that Samuel had owed him money, and that the debt transferred. Mae stood at the garden gate with her hands quiet at her sides and looked at him very steadily, and said that her husband was not home, but that she would be happy to discuss the matter when he returned, and that in the meantime, the men were welcome to water their horses at the trough and then move along. The man called Carver smiled at this in a way that was not friendly, and said that he would prefer to discuss it now, and took a step toward her. The sound of a horse at the near edge of the property made all 3 men look up, and Timothy Walden came across the pasture at a hard lope on the big gray gelding, and he had seen enough from the distance to understand the shape of what was happening, and he rode up between the men and his wife with the kind of controlled directness that reminded me briefly, sharply, that this was a man who had survived hard things. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for anything. He sat his horse and he looked at Carver and he said, "My brother Samuel died of fever in the fall of '76. He owed no gambling debts to you or anyone, because he spent his last year saving every cent he had for his land. I know this because I was here. You were not. Whatever story you have told yourself about what you are owed is wrong, and I would suggest you ride off my property before I am forced to send for the sheriff and explain the particulars." Carver held the look between them for a long, uncomfortable moment, the kind of moment that could still tip in any direction, and Mae stood very still at the garden gate and watched her husband's back, and felt something that was not quite fear because it was too steady for that, more like concentrated alertness. Then Carver looked away first. Men like Carver, she had noticed, were very good at reading the distinction between a man who was performing toughness and a man who had earned it, and Timothy Walden was clearly the second kind. The 3 men turned their horses and rode back the way they had come without another word. Timothy sat on reckoning for a moment watching them go. Then he turned to me. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I told them to water their horses and leave. They did not immediately leave." "I know, I saw. You rode fast," she said. "Yes," he said, and dismounted, and stood there holding Reckoning's reins with his jaw set in a way that suggested the exterior calm was doing considerable work on behalf of the interior. He looked at her with an intensity that she recognized as something beyond concern. "I am fine," she said, and she walked to him and put her hand on his arm, the same gesture as in the dark, the same grounding touch. "I was not hurt. They were bluffing men, I could see that." "You should not have had to see that," he said. "No," she agreed. "But I did, and it is done, and I would like to know if you are all right." He looked at her for a long moment. The muscle in his jaw eased slowly. "I am," he said. "Now." She nodded once and went back to the garden because the tomatoes still needed attending to regardless of what else was happening, and because she knew that returning to the ordinary was one of the most useful things you could do after a moment of fear. That evening on the porch, after supper, Timothy said, "I want to ask Douglas Pratt if we can put up a better fence on the North Road. And I want to ride into town tomorrow and have a conversation with Sheriff Bell." "That is a sensible idea," Mae said. "I was not handling it the right way before," he said. "When men like that came, I used to—" He paused. "I used to let it sit in me for days, the anger, the readiness." He turned his hat in his hands. "You went back to your tomatoes." "The tomatoes needed attending to," she said. "That is not what I mean," he said. "I know what you mean," she said. But I also genuinely mean what I said. When the threatening thing is over, the ordinary thing should resume. The ordinary thing is what the threatening thing was trying to take away. Giving it up afterward is giving it a second victory. Timothy was quiet for a while, looking at the evening spreading its colors over the prairie. "I never thought about it that way," he said. "I know," she said, "but I think you will." He did. It was not immediate. It did not happen in a week or a month. But it happened with the same kind of gradual certainty as the prairie grass coming back in the spring, steady and quiet and pervasive, filling in the spaces that the hard seasons had left bare. In August, Mae confirmed what she had suspected for about 3 weeks, and she told Timothy on a Saturday evening after supper, on the porch, with the sunflowers still standing in the garden below them, their heads turned to catch the last of the western light. She said, "I believe we are going to have a child in the spring." Timothy put down the fence post drawing he had been examining and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. It was open in a way his face was not usually open. It was the expression of a man who has been handed something he had not let himself expect. "In the spring," he said. "March or April, I would think," she said. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him breathe. "We need a second bedroom," he said finally, which was both the most practical and the most emotionally loaded sentence he could have chosen, and she loved him for it absolutely. "We do," she agreed. He looked at the house as if measuring it. Then he looked at her. And then he got up from his chair and he crossed the 2 feet of porch between them, and he went down on one knee beside her rocking chair, which was not a gesture she had expected from him, and he took her hand in both of his and said, "Me." That was all he said, but the way he said it, with her name carrying everything that would not fit into words, told her everything she needed to know. She put her free hand on his face, which was weathered and good and hers, and she said, "I know." Jesse Alcott, when told the following morning, celebrated with such uncomplicated enthusiasm that he knocked over a bucket of feed and did not notice for several minutes, which made both Timothy and me laugh in a way that filled the whole kitchen. The second bedroom was framed by September and finished by October. Timothy and Jesse working on it in the evenings after the main ranch work was done. Douglas Pratt coming over 2 Saturdays to help with the roof joinery. Mae whitewashed the walls herself, which Timothy argued against and which she ignored with serene efficiency, because she was not an invalid and whitewashing a room was not beyond her capacity even in her condition, and the room came out a warm, clean white that she was very pleased with. In the first week of October, Timothy rode north along the river to the parcel that Samuel had wanted. He did not tell me where he was going until he came back, and when he came back he sat down at the kitchen table and told her that the land was still available and that it could be purchased for a fair price. Mae sat down across from him with her coffee. "What would you do with it?" "Expand the herd," he said. "Eventually, when Jesse is old enough to manage more," he was looking at his coffee cup. "I would fence it the way Samuel planned. He had a whole scheme for the fencing. I have got his notes from when he talked it all through with me." "Then we should buy it," Mae said. He looked up. "It is a significant expenditure." "It is the right thing," she said. "And the cattle market is going to improve. Anyone who watches the rail prices can see that. We have the reserves." "Buy the land, Timothy." He bought the land in November, and the deed to it he kept in the same tin box where he kept Samuel's letters, and Mae thought that was right. Winter came in December with the serious intent that Kansas winter always brought, the kind of cold that meant business, the kind that tested whether your wood was stacked high enough and your stock was bedded well. Mae was large with the child by now, moving around the house with the patient management of a woman who has decided to refuse inconvenience as a concept, and she ran the household with the same capability she had applied to it from the beginning. There was a quality to that winter that she would remember for the rest of her life, a deep and particular quality of warmth that had nothing to do with the stove, though the stove was always good. It had to do with the evenings, with Timothy sitting across the table from her in the lamplight, reading or working on the account books, or doing nothing at all except being present in the same room with her, and the snow pressing against the windows in white silence, and Persimmon the cow safe in the warm barn, and Jessie in the bunkhouse presumably asleep, and the whole property gathered around them like a held breath. One evening in January, Timothy looked up from the account book and said, without preamble, "I slept through the night last week." Mae looked up from the letter she was writing to her sister Clara. "I know," she said. "I noticed. It has been," he thought about it, "a long time since that happened with any regularity. It has been happening more often since September," she said. "But last week was the whole week." He looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read, but part of it was something like wondering, the particular wondering of a man who had stopped expecting certain things and is now confronted with their arrival. "You kept count," he said. "I keep account of the things that matter to me," she said, and went back to her letter. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Timothy," she said, still writing. "I love you," he said, which was not a thing he had said before, though she had felt it in 100 other ways, and the directness of it now made her set down her pen and look at him fully. "I know," she said, and then, because he deserved to hear it said plainly too, "I love you too." He nodded once, as if this confirmed something important that he had not been entirely certain about, and went back to the account book, and the snow went on pressing at the windows, and Mae picked up her pen and found she was smiling at the paper. The baby arrived in late March of 1879, which Mae chose to regard as spring on principle, even though there was still frost in the mornings, because she had announced March or April, and March was close enough. It was a boy, born at dawn after a long and serious night, delivered by Mrs. Hall from the neighboring property who was experienced in such matters, with Timothy present in the way that husbands of the era were not always permitted to be, but which Mae had decided at the outset was going to be the case regardless of convention. She would remember later the quality of Timothy's presence through that night. He did not pace. He did not make the kind of useless, distraught declarations that men often made in such situations. He sat beside her and held her hand and said, when the worst of it was upon her, and she had her teeth set and her eyes focused on the far wall with the concentrated will of someone moving a very large object, "You are the strongest person I know." She could not laugh in that moment, but she wanted to. The boy was healthy and large and had Timothy's dark hair, and at the particular angle when the dawn light hit him right, a suggestion of Timothy's gray eyes, though Mae knew that infant eyes were not yet settled in their color. She held him in the exhausted golden morning, and Timothy sat beside her with his elbows on his knees and looked at the baby with an expression that was entirely new on his face, something unguarded and enormous and irreversible. "His name," Mae said. "You choose," Timothy said, which surprised her because she had expected him to have opinions. "Samuel," she said. Timothy looked at her. The line of his jaw moved. "If that is all right with you," she said. "Yes," he said after a moment in a voice that was not entirely steady. "Yes, that is more than all right." She watched his face rearrange itself around this, the grief and the gratitude folding into something new, and she thought that this was perhaps the most important thing she had understood about Timothy Walden, that grief and gratitude were not opposites in him, but were woven together so tightly that you could not ease one without touching the other. They called him Sam, which was what Samuel's notes called himself in the margins of his plans, and from his first days Sam Walden seemed to arrive in the world with a settled and definite personality, alert and opinionated, and already, Mae suspected, planning something. Jesse Alcott met the baby with the same unguarded enthusiasm he brought to everything, holding Sam in his arms with the extreme careful tension of someone transporting nitroglycerin, and making a series of faces at the infant that served no practical purpose but which made me genuinely happy. "He is very small," Jesse said. "He is a very good size for a baby," Mae said. "How does something this small become a person?" Jesse asked, with genuine philosophical curiosity. "Slowly," Timothy said from the doorway, "and with considerable assistance." Spring deepened around them as Sam grew, and Mae watched the year turn with a feeling that she could only compare to the satisfaction of watching a garden come up, the pleasure of seeing the things you have tended begin to fulfill their intentions. The South Garden was in better form than its first year, because she had learned the particular enthusiasms and resistances of that soil, and could now work with them more intelligently. The cattle herd was larger, the new acreage along the river beginning to contribute to the operation's overall health. Jesse Alcott, now 18, was developing from a competent helper into a genuinely skilled ranch hand, and Timothy taught him with the patient care that Mae had always believed was one of Timothy's finest qualities. Elias Webb came back in May, and this time he stayed a week, and he held Sam with considerably less extreme tension than Jesse had managed, with the ease of a man who had held children before, and Mae noted this and asked him about it on the second day while he was helping her carry the washing in from the line. "I was married," he said, which she had not known. "A long time ago, before I enlisted. There was a daughter." Mae waited. "They both died," he said. "Cholera." 67. He handed her a folded sheet with the precise economy of movement that characterized everything he did. "I do not talk about it." "No," Mae agreed, "but you remember it." "Every day," he said, without particular drama, as a statement of fact. Mae thought about this. "You should come back for Sam's birthday in August," she said. "Bring someone if you like, we will do it properly." Elias looked at her sideways. "What do you mean, bring someone?" "I mean if there is someone you spend time with who would enjoy a proper supper and a celebration," Mae said. "You should bring them." Elias was quiet for a moment. "There is a woman in Dodge City," he said carefully. "A widow. She runs the laundry." "What is her name?" Mae asked. "Ruth," he said. "Ruth Hensley. Bring Ruth Hensley to Sam's birthday in August," Mae said, as if the matter were already settled, because in her estimation it was. Elias opened his mouth and then closed it again. "You are a remarkable woman," he said finally. "I am an ordinary woman with clear priorities," Mae said, taking the last pillowcase from the line. "Those two things produce similar results, but one of them is more sustainable." She walked toward the house with the laundry basket, and Elias followed her, and she thought she heard him laughing quietly behind her, which she considered a very good sign. The summer of 1879 was hot and dry in the particular way of Kansas summers, the kind of heat that turned the sky white by noon and made even the most energetic animals slow and contemplative by mid-afternoon. Mae managed the household through it with the practical adjustments of a woman who had decided the climate was going to cooperate with her plans, whether it wanted to or not. She moved the main cooking to the early morning and the evening. She kept the root cellar stocked with cool water crocks. She put a canvas shade over the garden's most vulnerable plants, and she adapted. Timothy watched her manage all of this with an admiration he expressed in practical terms, repairing the well casing to improve the water flow, adding a shade structure to the barn's east side, bringing in an extra load of ice from the ice house in town when the July heat peaked at something ungodly, and staying that way for a week. Sam, at 4 months, seemed entirely unbothered by the heat, sleeping through the worst of it with the complete indifference to external conditions that Mae was beginning to think might be the defining trait of his character. On an evening in late July, when the heat had finally broken with a thunderstorm that moved through fast and loud and left everything smelling like wet grass and lightning and the strange electric cleanness that followed prairie storms, Mae and Timothy sat on the porch in the aftermath and watched the last of the clouds move east, trailing veils of distant rain. "Tell me something," Mae said. "What kind of something?" Timothy asked. "Something you have not told me yet," she said. "There must be something." He thought about this for a while, the way he thought about things, seriously and without hurry. "When I was 17, he said, "before any of the army, I wanted to be a school teacher." Mae looked at him. "A school teacher?" "I was good at it. My teacher, Mr. Alcott, told me I had a talent for explaining things and a patience that would serve me well." He paused. "I used to imagine a classroom, a white building with a bell on it, Students who needed to understand something and me being the one to help them understand it. What happened? She asked. The war happened first, then the army, then Samuel wanted to come west, and coming west seemed like the right thing. He was quiet for a moment. I don't regret it, but sometimes I wonder about that classroom. Me looked at the dark shape of the cottonwoods along the river, their leaves still moving in the storm's aftermath. Jesse, she said, what about Jesse? You have been teaching Jesse for over a year, she said. Not just the ranch work, you have been teaching him everything. He told me last week that you lent him 3 books and explained the water rights law to him because he asked a question about irrigation. Timothy was quiet. You have your classroom, me said. It does not have a white building and a bell, but the student needed something and you have been helping him understand it. I would say that counts. He was very still beside her for a moment, and then he turned and looked at her with those gray eyes that had lost, she thought, about half of their storm since February of last year. They still had weather in them, they probably always would, but the weather was further back now, more like the distant thunder of the receding storm than the crack of lightning directly overhead. How do you do that? He said. Do what? See things the way you see them, he said. Make them make sense in a way they did not before. Me considered this honestly. I think, she said slowly, that I see what is actually there. Not what I am afraid is there or what I wish were there, just what is. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, and they sat like that while the prairie dripped and steamed and settled, and the last light went out of the western sky, and the stars came out one by one in the cleared air, sharp and closed the way they always were after rain. August came and Elia's Webb came with it, and he brought Ruth Hensley. Ruth Hensley was 40 years old, a small, direct woman with calloused hands and bright brown eyes, and the manner of someone who had been running a business alone since her husband died of a horse accident 5 years ago and had developed accordingly. She arrived in Elia's Webb's wagon looking around the Walden property with the frank assessment of a woman who was evaluating whether it was worth her time, and when she met me, she put out her hand immediately in the way that women who ran businesses did, expecting to be met as an equal. Me met her hand and liked her immediately and thoroughly. The birthday supper for Sam, who at 5 months was not particularly aware that he was being celebrated, but who managed to be extremely charming about the whole enterprise, was held on the porch and the yard in the warm August evening, with Douglas Pratt and his wife Edna in attendance, and Jesse Alcott in his best shirt which he had pressed himself with varying success, and Ruth Hensley, who turned out to be an exceptional baker, and arrived with a proper cake which elevated the entire occasion. Me watched Elia's Webb at that supper, with the quiet pleasure of someone whose instinct had been right. He sat beside Ruth Hensley and talked to her with the ease he almost never showed with anyone, and Ruth talked back with the directness that was clearly her natural mode. And several times during the evening they were simply looking at the same thing, Sam, or the prairie, or the last of the light, in the particular companionable silence of people who are comfortable in each other's presence. After the guests had gone and Jesse was in the bunkhouse and Sam was in his room sleeping the deep sleep of a well-fed infant, me and Timothy washed the supper dishes together in the kitchen, which was a habit they had fallen into and which me particularly valued because the combination of a task and proximity tended to produce the best conversations. Elia's looks better, Timothy said, drying a plate. He does, me agreed. Ruth is good for him. Ruth is excellent, me said. They are good for each other. Timothy dried another plate. You knew that before you invited him. I suspected it, she said. You have been matchmaking, he said, and there was something in his voice that was entirely warm. I went to a matchmaker, me said. I know the value of the service. He put the dried plate on the shelf and looked at her with his full attention the way he did when something had struck him in a new place. Mrs. Hargrove put us together, he said slowly. She did. And you asked her for a peaceful man. I did. And she gave you me, he said, with something in his voice that was not quite self-deprecation but contained the same awareness, the acknowledgement of what he had been when she found him. Me turned from the washbowl and looked at him directly. She gave me the best man in her ledger, she said. Those were her exact words. She was right. The quiet between them was entirely different from the quiet of that first parlor meeting, from the careful distances of two people who do not yet know each other. It was the quiet of home. I have been thinking, Timothy said, about peace, what it actually is. Tell me, she said. I used to think it was the absence of things, he said. The absence of fighting, the absence of fear, the absence of grief. I kept waiting for all those things to stop so the peace could start. He picked up another dish to dry. I think it is not an absence. I think it is a presence. I think it is this. The dishes and the kitchen, and you here, and Sam asleep upstairs, and the garden growing outside, and knowing what the morning is going to look like. Mae was quiet for a moment, holding a wet cup. I have known that for a while, she said, but I am very glad you have figured it out. He looked at her, and the ghost of that smile, the one she had first seen in Mrs. Hargrove's parlor, came across his face, only it was not a ghost any more. It lived in him much more freely now. It came and went like proper weather rather than like something rare and uncertain. I am getting there, he said. You are there, she said. You just haven't noticed yet. She put the last cup on the shelf and dried her hands and kissed him once, solid and intentional, the way she did most things, and went upstairs to check on Sam. Fall came to the Walden property with its enormous beauty, the cottonwoods going gold and copper along the river, the cattle fat on the late summer grass, the root cellar full, and the hay stacked high, and everything in the order of a property well managed by people who knew what they were doing. Mae confirmed in October that there would be another child in the summer. She told Timothy in the morning this time at the kitchen table over coffee, and his response was different from the first time, less undone and more deeply glad, the difference between a man receiving something unexpected and a man receiving something he had allowed himself to hope for. June, he asked. June or July, she said. He nodded. We will need to add to the root cellar, he said. That is not the first thing most men say, she observed. The first thing most men say is what I am feeling, he said. What I am saying is what needs to happen. She understood this. She poured him more coffee. Douglas Pratt's wife Edna began visiting regularly that fall, bringing preserves or fresh bread on the pretext of being in the neighborhood, which Mae understood to mean that Edna wanted to watch Sam and hold Sam, and generally spend time in a house that had a baby in it, because her own children were grown and gone, and the house east of the ridge was a quieter place than she preferred. Mae welcomed this with genuine warmth, because Edna Pratt was a woman of considerable experience and good humor, and because having someone nearby who had navigated 2 pregnancies and 4 children in the Kansas Territory was a resource that only a fool would not draw on. Jesse Alcott celebrated his 18th birthday in November, and Mae made him a proper supper and a cake, and Timothy gave him a copy of a book on land management that Mae suspected was both a practical gift and a statement of intent regarding Jesse's future. Jesse received this with the look he sometimes had when Timothy did something that caught him off guard in a good way, something between gratitude and something much larger that he did not quite have words for yet. After supper, while Mae was cleaning up in the kitchen, she heard Timothy and Jesse on the porch, their voices low and steady. Heard Timothy say, "When you are ready to think about your own land, I want you to know the Calder parcel north of the river is likely to come available in the spring. I would help you evaluate it." She heard Jesse say after a pause, "I don't have the money for land." She heard Timothy say, "You have been earning wages for a year and a half and spending almost none of them because you live on this property. You have more than you think. Run the numbers." Another pause. Then Jesse said, "Mr. Walden." "Timothy," Timothy said, which he had told Jesse to say at least a dozen times. "Timothy," Jesse said, "why do you? I am not." He stopped, started again. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't," Timothy said. "Run the numbers." Mae stood in the kitchen holding a wet plate and feeling the particular satisfaction of a person who has watched something important happen and had the wisdom to stay out of its way. Winter came again, and with it the 2nd December of their marriage, and Mae thought, sitting in the lamplight of the kitchen one evening in early December with snow falling outside and Sam asleep upstairs and Timothy across the table from her sketching plans for a spring expansion of the horse operation, that if she had written a letter to Mrs. Hargrove a year ago describing her life, Mrs. Hargrove would have recognized it as the life me had come in asking for, with the addition of several things me had not known to ask for, which were the better parts. She thought about the morning she had walked into that office. The cold, the frost in the window corners, the certainty that she would simply say what she wanted and find out if it was possible. She had wanted quiet mornings. She had them. The mornings on the Walden property were the quietest, most complete things she had ever experienced. The river sound coming across the frozen air from the east, the horses moving in the pasture, the particular stillness of a winter prairie at dawn before any of the working day had begun. She had wanted a man who did not carry a gun into the house. Timothy left his rifle in the barn, which she had never asked him to do but which he had done from the first week, and she had noted it and said nothing because it was his decision and his house too. She had wanted a man who did not owe debts to dangerous men. Timothy owed no such debts. He owed the bank a fair mortgage on the Samuel parcel, which was a different thing entirely and in good standing. She had wanted to sit on a porch in the evening and watch the sun go down without flinching at shadows. She sat on the porch every evening that the weather permitted and Timothy sat with her, and he did not flinch at shadows any more. Or when he did, it was rare enough and brief enough that it did not dismantle anything. It was weather passing through, not weather living there. She had gotten what she asked for. She had also gotten things she had not asked for, the particular pleasure of being known by someone who paid attention, the company of a man whose quiet was the good kind, the daily satisfaction of work that was genuinely hers and genuinely mattered, and a son named Sam who was already, at 7 months, the most opinionated person on the property. "You are smiling at your coffee," Timothy said, without looking up from his sketches. "I am thinking," she said. "About what?" "About Mrs. Hargrove's ledger," she said. He did look up then. She met his eyes across the table, across the lamplight, across everything. "She made a good match," he said. "She made an excellent match," me agreed. June arrived in the following year with a warmth that was generous rather than brutal, and the second baby came on a Sunday morning, fast and decisive, as if making up its mind to get things done, which me took as a personal quality she would want to keep an eye on. It was a girl this time, born in the good summer light with the south garden visible from the bedroom window in its full height and flower. The sunflowers me had planted again, standing gold and enormous against the sky. Timothy named her Lily, which me had not expected. She had thought he might choose something more traditional. "There was a wildflower meadow near where Samuel's parcel is," he said, the morning after, sitting beside me on the bed with Lily in his arms and Sam toddling around the room touching everything he could reach. Samuel called it the lily field even though there were not very many actual lilies. He said lilies belonged everywhere they could grow. Me looked at her husband holding their daughter in the morning light, Sam periodically running into him and bouncing off with complete satisfaction, and she felt something so full and complete in her chest that she could not speak for a moment. "Lily is exactly right," she said. Elia's Webb arrived in August with Ruth Hensley, and this time they arrived in the same wagon, which told me everything she needed to know, though she waited to ask until the right moment. Ruth was as direct as ever, maybe more so, and she held Lily with the ease of someone who had decided that life owed her some softness, and was going to accept it graciously when it arrived. "Ask me in April," Ruth told me, while they were in the kitchen and the men were outside with the children. I said yes in May. "We have not quite gotten to the making it official part." "Why not?" me asked. "Because he thinks he is too old and damaged to do it right," Ruth said, with the exasperated affection of a woman who had been having this conversation for several months. "He is 43 and capable of enormous good if someone insists on it," me said. Ruth looked at her with recognition. "Is that how you did it with Timothy?" "No," me said. "I did not insist on anything. I just showed up every day and was what I am, and eventually the space I was taking up became a space he needed filled. She paused. I think you have already done that with Elias. He just has not recognized the logistics. Ruth considered this. Then she said, "Can I borrow your husband to talk some sense into him?" Me smiled. "You can try. He may be more effective than you expect." Timothy and Elias walked the river fence line together that afternoon, which was the excuse. And when they came back 2 hours later, Elias Webb had the look of a man who has had an argument he did not win, but did not entirely want to win. That evening at supper, Elias said to the table in general, "We are getting married in September." Ruth Hensley lifted her coffee cup in acknowledgement. Jesse Alcott cheered, which startled Sam, who was sitting in Me's lap, and then Sam cheered too in imitation, not understanding the occasion but entirely willing to be enthusiastic about it. Me met Timothy's eyes across the table and he met hers, and the look between them contained, she thought, about 3 years' worth of things, all of them good. In September of 1880, Elias Webb and Ruth Hensley were married in Dodge City, and Me and Timothy attended with both children. Sam, who was old enough to be present and was extremely determined to be included in everything, and Lily, who was 3 months old, and spent the ceremony in a bundle on Me's chest, sleeping with her customary serenity. The wedding was small and unornamented and genuinely happy, and Elias Webb looked, for the first time in Me's experience of him, like a man who has put down something he has been carrying for a very long time. He stood at the front of the small church and watched Ruth come down the aisle with an expression of such unguarded tenderness that Me had to look away, not because it was inappropriate to observe, but because it felt private in the way that the most real things are private. They stayed in Dodge City 2 nights, and on the second evening Me and Ruth sat on the hotel porch while the men were inside with the baby and Sam, who had apparently located a deck of cards and was attempting to deal them with considerable personal authority. "Did you always know it would work?" Ruth asked. She meant Elias. She also meant, Me thought, the broader question. "With Timothy," Me said. "With everything. Coming to a stranger's homestead with your trunks, saying yes to a man you had met twice, all of it." Me thought about this honestly. "No," she said. "I never knew, I believed. Those are different things." She looked at the Dodge City street, the evening traffic of horses and wagons, and the particular western twilight that fell over everything like a stage curtain coming down. "Knowing requires certainty. Believing requires only conviction. I had conviction." "I wish I had your conviction," Ruth said. "You have your own kind," Me said. "You built a business alone in a frontier town after your husband died. That is not a thing a woman without conviction does." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "I was scared when I came to your house the first time," she said. "In August of last year, I thought I might be making a fool of myself." "You were brave when you were scared," Me said. "That is the only kind of brave that counts." The prairie year completed itself in the fall of 1880 with the satisfaction of something that has gone according to a plan more generous than the one originally written. The Walden property was in its 3rd autumn of Me's tenancy, and it was, she thought, objectively excellent. The cattle numbers had more than doubled from the original 80 head. The horse operation Timothy had been planning was beginning to produce results. 3 foals in the spring having gone to buyers in Abilene at prices that justified the expansion. The Samuel parcel to the north was fenced the way Samuel had planned it, which Timothy had taken as a particular project over the summer, and standing at the boundary of it on an October afternoon, Me could see it clearly as an act of love, the kind of love that continues past the person it is intended for and becomes part of the landscape itself. Jesse Alcott did not buy the Calder parcel in the spring, because the Calder parcel turned out to have a water issue that Timothy identified before any money changed hands, which was exactly the kind of thing Timothy noticed, and which was exactly why Jesse should not have tried to evaluate land without him. But Jesse had his money still saved, and his eye on a different parcel that came available in the autumn of 1880, 15 acres adjoining the Walden property to the southwest, modest but sound, and Timothy walked it with him in early October and said it was good land and that the price was fair. Me made a special supper the night Jessie signed the papers. She made a roast chicken and potatoes, and the good cornbread and the apple preserves she had been keeping for a special occasion, and she had been right to keep them, because this was exactly the right occasion. A young man who had arrived lame-horsed and penniless standing at her kitchen table with a land deed in his hand looking as if someone had handed him the sun. "You should invite someone to the supper," Me had said, when Jessie arrived for the occasion. Jessie turned a color that clashed with his best shirt. "I don't know who you mean," he said. "I think you do," Me said, and turned back to the roast chicken. He had not invited her this time, but Me was patient, and she suspected the situation was developing, because she had watched Jessie ride past the Calder property, and then the new property 3 times in a month despite neither of them being on any direct route between the Walden ranch and town. And she had noticed that the Calder family had a daughter of 19 named Anna who came to church in Abilene, with an expression of intelligence and considerable patience with her 3 younger brothers, which Me regarded as a substantial character reference. Timothy said, at supper that evening, when Jessie had gone back to what was now technically his own land even if the small soddy on it was barely a shelter yet, "You are going to find him a wife." "I am going to let him find his own wife," Me said, washing Sam's face with the methodical care of someone who has learned that a 1-year-old's relationship to food is inherently sculptural. "I am just going to make it possible." "That is exactly what matchmaking is," Timothy said. "Then I come by it honestly," Me said. "Sit still, Sam." Sam said something emphatic that was almost a word, possibly several words compressed into one. Lily, in her basket near the stove, made a sound of pure generalized contentment. Timothy leaned over and picked up Lily with the easy confidence of a man who had learned how to hold infants, and settled her against his shoulder, and looked at Me over Lily's head with an expression that she could not ever quite describe but which she felt entirely. "I used to think," he said slowly, "that the army years and Samuel's death and all of it had taken something out of me permanently. Like something had been removed that could not be put back." Me looked at him, her hand still on Sam's face cloth. "I was wrong," he said. "Things were not removed, they were waiting. They needed the right conditions to come back." She was quiet for a moment. "You created the conditions yourself," she said. "You built the property, you kept the land, you stayed. You provided the conditions," he said. "We provided them together," she said, which was the truth of it, and they both knew it. The winter of 1880 settled into the Walden house with all the particular domestic warmth that Me had been building toward since April of 1878. Sam, who had recently discovered running and considered it vastly preferable to walking, navigated the house at high speed and with considerable conviction, and Lily watched him from her various positions with the detached scientific interest of someone studying a phenomenon she planned to replicate once she was capable. The house was not the stripped-down quiet space Timothy had been living in when Me arrived. It was full now, full of the accumulated evidence of people living in it. The rug and the curtains and the oval mirror and Sam's wooden horse and Lily's basket and 2 additional chairs, and a bookshelf that had more books than practical books now, and a jar of dried sunflower heads on the kitchen windowsill because Me kept them every year. Timothy, on an evening in late December, sat down with Me after the children were asleep and produced, from the drawer of the side table, an envelope. "What is this?" she asked. "A letter from Mr. Alcott," he said. "He is retired in Lawrence now. He heard somehow, probably from Douglas Pratt's people, that I was ranching east of Abilene, and he wrote." Me opened the letter, because Timothy handed it to her rather than reading it himself, which told her something about the quality of his feelings about it. Mr. Alcott, who was 68 and writing in a clear hand that showed he had remained a careful man, said that he was glad to hear Timothy was settled and doing well. He said he had thought of Timothy often over the years, that he had always believed Timothy had a particular capacity for building things that endured, and that whatever Timothy had built, He hoped it was worthy of that capacity. He also said in the last paragraph that if Timothy ever found himself in Lawrence with time to spare, he hoped Timothy might visit because he missed his better students and had reached the age where he could admit it freely. Mae folded the letter and handed it back. Timothy was looking at the fire. "Write to him," she said. "I am not certain what I would say." "Tell him what you built," she said. "Tell him about Sam and Lily and the property and Jesse Alcott who you have been teaching. And yes, I know his name is a coincidence, but it seems like a good one. Tell him the things you built." She paused. "And tell him we will come to Lawrence in the spring if he is agreeable." Timothy looked at her. "We, you and I and Sam and Lily," she said, as if this were obvious because to her it was. "You should not go to see a teacher who meant something to you alone. You should go as the person you have become." Timothy was quiet for a long moment, turning the letter in his hands. "Lawrence in the spring," he said. "Write to him tonight," she said, "before you change your mind." He wrote that night, sitting at the kitchen table with his pen and the good lamp, and Mae sat across from him and read her sister Clara's latest letter while he wrote, and the snow came down outside with the sound of quiet, and Sam slept the deep, confident sleep of a child who has never had a reason to be uncertain about who would be there in the morning, and Lily made small sounds in her sleep that were not unhappy, and Persimmon the cow was warm in the barn, and Reckoning the gray gelding was in his stall with his hay, and the Walden property lay under the winter sky as something entirely itself, tended and inhabited and alive. Mae finished her sister's letter, put it down, and looked at her husband writing at the kitchen table. She thought about that February morning in 1878, the frost on Mrs. Hargrove's window, the careful voice saying this is the best man in my ledger, and the particular quality of the pause before Mae had said, "Then let us arrange a meeting." She thought about what she had asked for and what she had received, and the difference between the two, which was not a disappointment but an abundance, because what she had asked for was the floor and what she had been given was the entire building. She thought about what Timothy had said. Things were not removed. They were waiting. They needed the right conditions. She thought about the nightmares that came now only occasionally and briefly, and which she could settle with a hand on his arm and 4 words. She thought about the way he had stood on this property when she first arrived, guarding it rather than inhabiting it, and the way he inhabited it now, the way you could see it in how he walked from the barn to the house, the ease of it, the ownership of it, the belonging. She thought about what Mrs. Hargrove had not said and should perhaps have, that the most peaceful men were not always the ones who had never known war, but sometimes the ones who had found their way through it to the other side, and that finding them in that other country which they had reached against considerable odds and were still mapping, was its own kind of extraordinary. In the spring of 1881, they went to Lawrence, all 4 of them. Timothy drove, Mae beside him on the wagon seat with Lily in her lap, Sam in the wagon bed, with a level of enthusiasm for the journey that expressed itself primarily through continuous commentary on every horse, cow, bird, cloud, and fence post visible from the road. Mr. Alcott met them at his door, a white-haired man of 68 with sharp eyes and a smile that went all the way up, and he looked at Timothy for a long moment and said, "There you are," which Mae thought was exactly the right thing to say. They stayed 2 days in Lawrence, and Mr. Alcott told stories about the young Timothy Walden who had been quick with mathematics and who had a gift for making complicated things clear, and Timothy listened to these stories with the expression of a man being shown a portrait of himself that he had forgotten existed, something between recognition and surprise. Sam sat in Mr. Alcott's parlor and thoroughly interrogated the old man's bookshelves, pulling books out and putting them back in the wrong places, and Mr. Alcott regarded this with the fond tolerance of a man who had spent 30 years watching children interact with books and had very specific feelings about the behavior. On the last evening after supper, Mr. Alcott said to Timothy, "Are you happy?" The question landed simply in the warm parlor. Mae waited, looking at her husband. Timothy thought about it with his characteristic honest consideration. Then he said, "Yes, I am." "Good," Mr. Alcott said. "That is the whole report. The rest of it, the land and the cattle and the children, that is the evidence. Happy is the conclusion." They came home to the Walden property on a May morning, the cottonwoods along the river in their full spring extravagance, the south garden already showing its first strong growth, the horses moving in the pasture with the particular ease of animals that know their land well. Sam fell asleep in the wagon bed in the last hour of the journey, and Timothy carried him into the house and up the stairs with the same settled confidence with which he did everything now. And me followed with Lily and stood in the upstairs hallway listening to the house settle around them. The creak of a familiar board, the sound of the prairie through the open window, the distant sound of Jesse Alcott doing something determined and purposeful on his adjacent parcel. Because Jesse Alcott was almost never not doing something determined and purposeful, which was a quality me privately considered her finest domestic contribution to the landscape. She stood in the hallway with Lily asleep on her shoulder and listened to Timothy coming out of Sam's room, the soft click of the door, his step on the boards, and then he was standing in the hall with her in the afternoon light, 2 years and 2 months into a marriage she had chosen with her eyes open and her list in her hand, and she looked at him. He looked like a man who had come home. Not because he had just arrived back from Lawrence, but in the deeper and more permanent sense of the word, the sense in which home is not a location but a condition, a state of being in which the body and the place and the people are all in the right relation to each other. "I was thinking," he said, keeping his voice low for the sleeping children, "that we might build a proper porch swing this summer." Me smiled. "What inspired that?" "Douglas Pratt has one," he said. "I have been envying it for 2 years." "Build a porch swing," she said. "I will need your input on the dimensions," he said. "You are the one who knows how long a person wants to sit outside in the evening." 2 hours, she said, "with the right company." "The dimensions are manageable," he said. She reached up and touched his face, her hand against the side of it, the weathered jaw that she knew as well as anything she had ever known. He put his hand over hers, holding it there. Outside the window, the Smoky Hill River went on doing what rivers do. The cottonwoods went on being extravagant. The cattle were in the summer grass on Samuel's parcel. The fencing was done exactly as Samuel had planned it. Jesse Alcott was hammering something with the conviction of a man who intends to build a life worth building, and the prairie spread out in all directions in its enormous, ordinary, extraordinary way. Mae Beckett had walked into a matchmaker's office and asked for a peaceful life. She had received instead something richer. A man who had not known peace in years, who had been waiting without knowing it for the kind of peace that required 2 people to build, the kind that was not an absence but a presence, not a stillness but a living thing, something you tended like a garden and which grew, given the right conditions, into something larger and more beautiful than either person had originally planned for. She had given him the conditions. He had done the same for her. And there on the Walden property, east of Abilene along the Smoky Hill River, in the spring of 1881, with Sam asleep in his room and Lily on her shoulder and a porch swing to be built, and a south garden to be planted, and a letter from Mr. Alcott in her pocket thanking them for coming, and Elias Webb and Ruth Webb in Dodge City building their own particular version of this same fundamental thing, and the prairie going on and on into the enormous blue distance that had always promised more than it warned about. Mae Beckett Walden stood in her hallway with her husband's hand over hers, and everything was exactly right. Not perfect. Not without its weather, not without its hard mornings and difficult seasons, and the occasional night when the old shadows moved through the room and needed attending to. But right. Deeply, sustainably, genuinely right, the way that things are right when they have been built by people who were honest about what they needed and willing to do the work. Timothy brought his face down to hers and kissed her quietly in the hallway, with Lily between them making the small sounds of her untroubled sleep, and me thought that this was what she had actually asked for when she told Mrs. Hargrove she wanted peace. not the absence of history, not a man without a past or without cost. She had asked to stop flinching at shadows. She had stopped. They both had. And the porch swing, when Timothy built it that summer, was exactly the right dimensions for two people sitting together in the long Kansas evenings, watching the sun go down over the river and the cottonwoods and the miles of ordinary beautiful land, not flinching at a single shadow.